And this brings us to Wendy. Wendy, you've been shifting from live to virtual as well. You've been planning events for over 15 years. So how difficult was it for you to shift from live to virtual?
So, for me, it wasn't as difficult because I have experience. I actually used to plan the in-person events just like Brian did for a technology company. So very similar, but with that, we always did virtual events as well, but it was more of the webinar format. So it was a natural pivot. And what I realized is that, when it comes to planning events, that 80% are really the same. It's whether it's in person or virtual. The 20% comes down to tech and touch. So Brian, mentioned that, and it's really all about, the most difficult part for me was really to wrap my head around what are the components of a live event that make it so experiential, and how can you replicate that in the virtual space? How can you really, just because you can't shake hands with people, what can we do to create community, to elicit engagement, and really form those connections that are formed in an in-person event? So that's where I really had to think outside of the box, learn tons of different technologies to figure out how am I going to select the best technology based on my client's goals.
So what would be the first step in hosting a virtual event?
The first step obviously is, you have to decide on your event, who is your audience, what are your goals, what problem are you going to solve, or what are their challenges, and how is your event going to help them to solve it? So I always say that success starts with strategy. And if you don't have those things really hammered in, then it's going to be more of a struggle as you progress. Obviously then you go through the same thing you would in an in-person event, figuring out who your speakers are, what is your agenda, all of that. Where I really focus the most of my time with my clients is on that engagement piece. So how can we facilitate breakouts? How do we facilitate the connections? And in doing so, a boring presentation on stage is going to be even more boring behind a screen. A non-attractive PowerPoint is going to be even less attractive behind the screen. And as Brian mentioned, you have all the competing things going on. You have the kids, you got the pets, you got email. It's so easy. In an in-person event, you're not just going to get up and walk out of the room. You're not going to pull up your phone and just have your head buried in it the entire time. So what can you do to make a virtual event a true experience? How can you make it two-sided, which actually becomes more of a benefit, because in the in-person space, you very rarely have, now Brian's events, you do have the opportunity, but very rarely are you at an event where you actually get that level of engagement with the speakers. With virtual, you're 18 inches away from the speaker. You're able to engage in a much greater way. So that's something that I spend a lot of my focus on. And then the other thing is learning how to facilitate those conversations. It comes down to intentional agenda design, intentional facilitation of, if you're sending people into breakouts, what are the questions you're having them answer? How are you having them answer it? Who's going to keep time? Who's going to come back and speak to the group? So just really being intentional and being the engineer of life-giving questions that when you go into the smaller breakout rooms, it's going to create the space for people to be more vulnerable. And that's where I truly believe those connections are built. So that's, with most of my clients, I encourage all of my clients to do some sort of breakout, small group, comeback, crowdsourcing, group shares. And even in the ones that don't, then it comes down to intentional agenda design. Are you going to have a live speaker with a PowerPoint? Don't do 6 of those in a row. Integrate it with a panel, do it with a hot seat, a Q&A, so that there's constantly a flow that's happening that keeps people engaged. And the last thing that I'll talk about, I just actually hosted my own virtual event last week, teaching event planners how to create experiences. And one of their biggest takeaways that it just happens naturally for me that I didn't realize was state change. Creating that state change. So if you're asking people to take notes, ask them to wave their pen in front of the computer. Before you go into a breakout, have them do something silly to, you know, transport. Same thing. I don't know if I'm sure you have been on Zooms where people clap and it just doesn't come across well. So, you know, this and showing energy, just little things like that. We brought in a DJ, and it's those little things that gets people back engaged. Like, you'll notice they're sitting there, they're watching, and then you do something like that and everyone has a smile on their face. So it's just that little state change. It's good for the speakers because they're speaking to an engaged audience, and it's great for the attendees because it brings them back to whatever, even if they were on a separate screen working on something, knowing when they're like, all right, everybody wave your pen, everybody's like scrambling to get back to the screen to wave their pen. So state change and music are also huge components of creating an experience.
Those are exceptional, and people without that experience that you've had wouldn't even think about those things. So that's great. And based on your experience, what are some of the most common mistakes you've seen people make in a virtual event?
I mean, definitely death by PowerPoint, just presentation after presentation. I mean, I kind of just spoke to the experience side of that, making sure that it's two-sided. There's a lot of technology mishaps that are happening because there's no shortage of platforms that are out there. So really knowing what are the capabilities of the different platforms that are going to accomplish your goals. Something else I've seen a lot is, you know, there's no shortage of speakers looking for virtual stages right now. And so I've been to a bunch of events where the speakers are just so all over the place that they're not all focused on one specific topic, one issue, which can be great because you're then marketing to a very broad audience. But at the same time, the engagement level really decreases because people are tuning in for speaker A versus speaker B. And for me, I you know, in my business, I'm focusing on impact and change and personal growth and development. So for me, the events that I work on, it's what is your target market? What are the challenges they're currently facing? Mm-hmm. And who can I bring in to speak that is going to complement what I'm speaking about, but also, or my clients are speaking about, but also fast track their success? What are the complementary, not competitive and not just so broad and out there? I think it's a matter of, you know, really knowing who your niche is and then communicating that to your speakers so they can tailor their presentation to speak specifically to your audience and not just broad, high level, so that people actually leave with tangible information that they can implement to gain results.
Excellent. And I've made some of those mistakes myself, specifically death by PowerPoint. I hide behind the PowerPoint, you know. They're looking at the PowerPoint, they're not looking at me. So